Good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to today's exciting webinar session. My name is Sam Peck. I am the Executive Director of Family Councils of Ontario. My pronouns are she and her, and it is my pleasure to welcome you to this afternoon's session. Before we get started, FCO does a land acknowledgement for our sessions. It's an important part of reconciliation and one of the recommendations in the Truth and Reconciliation Committee. So FCO was actually founded in Toronto, which is the traditional territory of many First Nations, including the Mississaugas of the Credit, the Anishinaabe, the Chippewa, the Haudenosaunee, and the Wendat people. And like where you're coming to us from in Ontario, is still home to many diverse First Nations, Inuit, and Métis people. FCO is a remote team. I'm based in Hamilton, which is Haudenosaunee territory. And we encourage everyone we work with, our team members, service users, and partners, to reflect on the ongoing legacy and impact of colonialism, and to think about meaningful reconciliation. There's a great website that is native-land.ca, where if you type in your address, it'll tell you what territory you're on, as well as the treaties and languages. It's a great resource to start with, to learn more about whose territory you're on. It's important because the work that non-Indigenous organizations and individuals need to do towards reconciliation with Indigenous people, it's a long-term journey. It is specific to each individual, and like others, it's constantly evolving for our organization. But I am glad that you are here with us today, and I encourage you to check out native-land.ca to learn more. This afternoon's session is, what does emotion-based care look like in practice? This is a very relevant topic. As a society, we're talking about how to improve long-term care to ensure that the sector, the system, works for people, that it works for residents, caregivers, home staff, and really everyone in a community. And emotion-based care, various models are one way to ensure that residents' needs are centered and that residents can help direct the care that they need. So on that note, it is now my pleasure to turn things over to Claude, the president of the CARP Ottawa chapter. Over to you.
Thank you, Sam, and good afternoon, everyone. On behalf of CARP Ottawa, it's my pleasure to welcome you all to this webinar, which CARP Ottawa is co-hosting with Family Councils Ontario. This is indeed a very important topic that we are discussing today. Transforming long-term care homes from task-based to an emotion-based model of care should be on the political agenda of all of our elected officials and public policy makers. This will certainly be a priority issue for us at CARP during the upcoming Ontario provincial election. In Ontario alone, CARP has over 200,000 members and 15 chapters, and transformative culture change in long-term care homes will be a top issue for CARP. I hope that if candidates come to your door during their campaign, soliciting your votes, that you will impress upon them the importance of fixing long-term care in Ontario and elsewhere, and in having their commitment to work to the implementation of emotion-based care. I want to thank Family Councils Ontario for collaborating with us on this webinar today. And now let me introduce to you Susan Zors, who's the Director of Operations at the Glebe Centre, Ottawa. Susan?
Thank you, and welcome everyone. It's my pleasure this afternoon to introduce Sally Knocker. Sally brings over 35 years of experience of working with older adults and those living with dementia. She has a particular passion for bringing fun, love, and meaningful activity to all parts of the day. More recently, she also brings her experience of supporting her mother while her stepdad lived in a care home in England throughout the pandemic. So welcome, Sally.
Thank you, everybody. It's really lovely to be here this afternoon and to see so many participants joining us, I think from certainly from Canada, but also from the UK, colleagues and friends as well, and hopefully other parts of the world as well. I have to say at the outset that obviously I'm unashamedly proud of being part of the Butterfly approach, which Meaningful Care Matters, my organisation, is supporting to develop throughout Ontario and Alberta and other parts of Canada. But I do say at the beginning that obviously there's not one way, there's obviously lots of different approaches that focus on emotion-based models. And I think the important message from my point of view is that we all need to be working together and not criticising each other too much and working collaboratively, because actually at the end of the day, we all want the same thing. And it's so, so important that now more than ever after the pandemic, that we have this supportive context to work in rather than being critical of each other. And I think for me, now more than ever, there's a momentum for change. We know that the Commission in Canada and the Long-Term Care Act is focusing much more on endorsing emotion-based models. It's an exciting time, but it's also a time where post-pandemic there's been obviously a culture of a lot of fear and anguish, and that this kind of culture can also sometimes make it quite difficult to further the goals that we're trying to achieve, because people are in a state of fear and adjustment, and there's been so much trauma in the last 2 years. And also, particularly in Ontario, I think a highly regulated context. I'll talk about this a little bit more in my presentation, but sometimes we've got to really look at the culture that the regulators are creating, so that we know that care homes want to do the right things, but sometimes be quite anxious about the repercussions, because sometimes to focus on emotion-based models, we do need to look at a more or less risk-averse culture. I want to say at the outset that for me, this is personal. As Susan has said, the fire is more in my belly because of the last 2 years of supporting my very lovely mum, who I think is listening now, Rosemary. And unfortunately, at the outset of the pandemic, my lovely stepfather, Bill, ended up in a care home following a hospital admission, a series of falls. And I can only say, and this is where I get emotional, is that although I've been in the field of dementia care for the last 30 years, my mum has taught me in the last 2 years what emotion-based care is really all about. Taking up to 14 phone calls a day, maybe more sometimes from Bill. Thank goodness he was still able to use the telephone, because they weren't able to see each other throughout the whole year. And the patience and the love that my mum showed to her husband, even though they were frustratingly close physically, but not able to see each other. And I know many of the listeners from CARP and family councils will relate to this very, very difficult experience. And although mum says she learns from me in the video clip I'm going to show you in a minute, I actually feel in lots of ways that, that I have learned a lot from her, and it's always very humbling. So I'm going to share a screen for a moment and show you a few pictures. And this is my mum and Bill in June 2019. Bill was a fabulous cook, which mum was delighted at, because she was never very keen on cooking. So I was very lucky to have a husband who was a great chef. And they enjoyed an amazing marriage with lots of wonderful holidays together. And I'm going to move on to the next slide, which is September 2020. And it still feels really difficult to look at this picture. And I think, again, many of you who are listening to this presentation will relate to the visits through the screen. And Bill was quite hard of hearing, so it was hard sometimes to make the connections, but you can see the love in his eyes and the way that they're reaching out to each other with their hands, and trying to make as much connection as was possible, despite the frustrations and the difficulties of not being able to be in the same room. So I'd like to hand over to my video friend here to play a little bit of video, which is me talking to my mum about how she managed to support Bill, often on the telephone, when he was feeling muddled and confused as his dementia progressed. If I could hand over to the video. because he often is travelling, isn't he?
Yes, well, you helped me, darling. You helped me by saying, well, I think I instinctively knew that I mustn't keep disagreeing with him, because you don't want to do that with anybody, dementia or not. And you helped me to say that Bill's travelling all the time. He's usually at a railway station or at an airport.
Sort of trying to get a ticket.
And he's waiting for something, waiting either for the aeroplane or the train or perhaps the baggage to arrive, but he's anxious on those occasions, always waiting for me. And so then I remember what you told me. I mustn't say, no, you're not at the airport, darling, you're in a nursing home. I say, oh my goodness, darling, well, let's try and sort it out. I can sort this out. And I usually say, don't worry, darling, wait where you are and I'll get a taxi to come and fetch you. And he says, oh, thank you.
Thank you for sharing that video, which is part of a longer film I did, an interview with my mum some time ago. And Bill actually died a year ago. So this presentation for me is very much in memory of Bill and in acknowledgement of my lovely mum. So yes, it's personal. It's not just for all of us. It's, you know, those of us who work in the field, we feel passionately about it. But for me, the big message is that this is something that affects us all our futures we're talking about. We shouldn't see people with dementia out there. It's actually, for all of us, a better future if we look at long-term care in a much more holistic way, that it isn't the clinical medical-based model that we're after. Most of us want to have a sense of family and friends. And I think relatives know that more than anything, but that love that you can see in the clip of my mum is what most people living with dementia want to receive. And that ability to be in someone's reality moment by moment, to not correct, to go alongside a person in whatever reality they are, is a core to the real meaning of emotion-based care. So what I thought I would do is to give a short presentation about what emotion-based care looks like in practice. And when I was talking to some of the people before we organised this, I thought, let's tell some real stories. I've obviously started with my own personal story, but the best way of showing emotional-based care in practice is some real stories. But before we do that, I thought we would look, if I could just get into the presentation again, at a little bit of the theory behind the stories. And I wanted to show, first of all, what it doesn't look like. I mean, I think a lot of people, when we talk about the butterfly approach, talk about the environmental changes. And I will share later that it isn't just about changing the environment. But I think it's very clear from some of the very stark images of many care homes that I visited over the last 20 or 30 years, that this isn't what emotion-based care doesn't look like. I mean, you can imagine that floor looks a little bit like water. It might be very frightening for a person living with dementia. It looks quite shimmery. It might create all sorts of problems. And this large television and the chairs around the room is this sort of very bleak environment that doesn't make us feel at all as if we're living at home. And some more pretty bleak images here, these long hallways with nothing to engage us, the beiges and the whites, the lack of colour, the lack of stimulation, the woman sitting there in a chair with very little to look at, all on her own in this space. These are the sort of bleak images which unfortunately are all too common in many of the care homes that I have visited over the years and even in recent times. And this is an example of where a transformation has happened in one of our homes in Alberta in Canada. And this, please notice here that this is the same room and the same sofa. So some people say we can't afford to make changes because it involves a lot of budget. But let's notice the difference in this environment from creating this rather sort of bland beige room to 9 months later with a butterfly project implementation to this space. And you can see the same sofa there and the vibrancy of colour just by throwing some lovely throws over the sofas or couches, the hat stand, the colours on the walls, the sense of an indoor garden at the back there. immediately there's a sense of a welcoming and inviting and colourful space. So these are kinds of examples of the sorts of butterfly homes we're working in all over the world. It's creating a home from home. You can see there the teapot on the table, the comfortable chair, the dresser in the background, the books on the table, the window to the lovely view outside. This is the kind of space that we're more likely to feel a sense of being at home and with family. Here, a rather boring sort of nursing station area has been converted into a kitchenette, and sort of some fresh fruit on the side there, some washing up on the line to invite discussions, and a lovely table on the right hand side, again in one of our Alberta homes, with a pretty tablecloth and a real sense of people sharing a meal together, a family dining experience. But none of this environmental stuff is really going to make a difference. I think sometimes people think with the butterfly approach, it is all about putting paint on the walls, but actually it's so much deeper than that. The real change we see is when we go to the heart of what people's social and psychological needs are. And this goes right back to the work of the quite well-known, certainly in England, but I think in Canada too, psychologist Professor Tom Kitwood, working in the 1990s in Yorkshire in the UK, who started to just try and look at a different way of seeing dementia and understanding that all of us as human beings have these profound psychological needs, that they sometimes become more enhanced if we develop cognitive impairments, but they are the same for all of us. And at the heart of those needs is love. And I think we should be unashamed about using the word love in the context of dementia care, because at the end of the day, it is what we all need to feel a sense of being part of something, being cared for, being really, truly loved by people that support us. And around this love is the petals of the flower that Tom Kitwood talked about. The need for our identity to be understood and seen and recognised, even as we age and develop a dementia, and in fact more so in a sense. Our need for comfort, particularly when we're feeling frightened or sad. Our need for attachment, deep psychological needs around secure attachments, which go right back to our early childhood messages, but become more pronounced again when we're in a vulnerable place. To know that we have that secure base around us that will hold us when we're feeling frightened or sad or lonely. The need to be occupied, to keep busy, to be involved in things, to still have purpose. And finally, also the need to be part of a community, to feel a sense of inclusion and belonging with others. But what I've done here is, and at Meaningful Care Matters, we've perhaps added a couple more petals in our thinking. And these two petals are sort of fairly new ideas that we're developing, but the need for freedom, a sense of feeling able to be free to do the things that have meaning for us, to not be constrained, to be able to go outside, to be able to move and to do the things that make sense to us, even if sometimes they don't make sense to others. And finally, the important psychological need of having fun. And this brings in all concepts of playfulness and laughter, the importance of humour for all our well-being sometimes, to give us well-being and to help us feel a sense of contentment and belonging and connection with others. So how do these psychological needs come about when we actually want to sort of tell the stories? And I think these stories that I'm going to tell now will probably give you a sense of all these petals on the flower being met by the amazing work that's been done by the care workers, care teams, supporting the individuals who I'll be talking about in the butterfly homes. So the first story is a story of a home in Toronto that I visited very recently. And I have to give thanks here to Dan, Georgie's husband, who's given permission to tell this story and also to share the picture of Georgie here, which he sent to me only yesterday. Georgie worked with her husband, Dan, till very recently in an organisation which basically makes the most amazing rock installations. And I gathered that one of them is in the Panda House at Toronto Zoo, but they've made amazing big sculptural installations using rocks and trees and natural formations. So Georgie's life with Dan was very much around, she was a teacher and an artist, doing a lot of very physical stuff, kind of making sure that everything was in place, climbing up on the rocks, helping her team to get things in place. She was an incredibly active and creative woman until her dementia developed in the last few years. So forward a few years, Georgie has been in and out of hospital and had a very distressing time with her dementia because her behaviours manifest themselves, unsurprisingly, in a desire to be very physical and to be very active. So she's heavily sedated and arrives in the care home in Toronto, in the region of Peel, basically in a very diminished and distressed state, bent double, very sedated, unable really to communicate. And then fast forward to a few months later, with the most amazing approaches of this butterfly team, Georgie continues to want to move. And the team recognise that this is part of her story, part of her identity, all those things in the comfort flower around occupation and identity. And she climbs onto the tables and she climbs onto the chairs and she moves around the room, picking things up, moving things, sometimes causing a little bit of disruption in the room for others. But the point is, as far as the team are concerned, they know that this is what makes sense to Georgie's well-being. They gently support her. When she gets up on the table, they don't tell her to come down. They don't get panicky. They just gently help her to get down safely. And she continues to move. And as I was observing a few weeks ago, Georgie at work, the lovely moments where she had hugs with the team members in between her work. And I felt like to her in that moment, the staff team were her colleagues or possibly her students. As she moves around the space, she has these lovely, affectionate moments with the team members and then continues to climb. This is what emotion-based care looks like. Georgie is still able to be who she needs to be. She's still at work. And for Dan, her husband, although it's obviously been a very distressing time, he has the confidence now that his wife is still experiencing real well-being in this amazing butterfly home. A second story, this time from Calgary in Alberta, of Sophie the dog, who belongs to one of the nurses in the home. And in this particular home, there's a woman called Caroline who gets very upset when she's having a bath. She hates personal care of any kind, and this is not unusual for many people living with dementia. It can be a distressing time when you have to be vulnerable with others when you're having any kind of personal care. But she absolutely loves Sophie the dog. That brings a smile to her face. Sophie's her best buddy. So what the care team work out, and in particular the nurse who owns Sophie, is that by bringing Sophie into the bathroom with her, all her distress is alleviated. The bath becomes a much less frightening place because for her, her attachment friend is Sophie the dog. And I can imagine some regulators becoming quite alarmed by the idea of a dog in a bathroom, all sorts of health and safety considerations to think about. But the point here is the home has put the emotional well-being of Caroline at the heart of their decisions, and that's what's made the real difference to her. Another story, this time from the UK, a home in Nottinghamshire in the UK. And this was an incident where I saw a man called Raj walking down the hallway, and he was carrying a very large china vase, and he was a bit wobbly on his feet. And there was a few moments when it looked as if he might drop the vase. It felt like it was a little bit precarious. And I saw one of the care team approaching Raj, and I wondered how they were going to cope with this. Many homes without butterfly training might well have said, "Oh, don't carry that, Raj, you're going to drop it." But instead, the worker, a lovely young male care worker, I think he might even have been a housekeeper, came up to Raj and said, "Thank you, Raj, so much for your help. That's really helpful of you. Could I take that off you and we'll go together and take it to the kitchen?" And Raj immediately stood tall because he felt that he'd done a job and he'd been appreciated instead of being told to stop or that he was causing a problem. The worker got it. He kept him safe, but he managed to still make this man feel that he was valued and that he had a role to play. A third story, again from Toronto, of a couple, Janet and Ray. The names are changed here because I haven't managed to check permissions, but for Ray, he'd had a very difficult time again in terms of his dementia and coming into a care home. And his wife too had found it very, very difficult to be separated from her beloved husband. And a few days after they moved into the care home, the Butterfly home discovered that it was actually their 60th wedding anniversary. And so they organised a surprise party for them both, including a very lovely cake created by the kitchen, the balloons and all the trimmings. And the whole team came in to celebrate their marriage, their relationship. And Janet told me that this made such a difference to her anxieties around the home and the changes that obviously we're both having to face, that their relationship and their love had been recognised in this way. Another story, quite an amusing one this time, again from Ontario, is I was visiting a home a few years ago now, and the care team was showing pictures of the royal family to a few people living in the living room area. And one of the women, her name is Caroline, saw Mary. Her name's Mary. She saw a picture of the Queen in one of the books, and Mary pointed at the picture of the Queen and with very serious expression on her face said, "That's my mother." Obviously, the familiarity and the warmth that she felt towards the Queen, in that moment, she represented her mum. And again, the lovely PSW, the personal support worker, smiled, looked at her in the face and said, "And isn't she a lovely woman?" She didn't seek to correct the woman that this was the Queen, not her mother. In that reality and in that moment, she acknowledged that for that woman, the Queen was her mum. So in all these stories, the key here is to try and work towards creating a sense of a real family home. It's hard in group living to do this. It takes time. And certainly with our Butterfly projects, the process is to really encourage the team to start to behave less as if they're at work, but more as if they are in someone's home. So this important message, we must always remember, we are working in people's home. They are not living in our workplace. How do we create a sense of home, and how do we reduce a sense of being at work? It can take time. Little things like thinking about how we walk through a room. I always say when we're sitting in our own living rooms, we don't have somebody just randomly walking through our room with a piece of paper and a book looking official, or somebody talking about shift changes or going on a break. All of these phrases that people talk about when they're at work, talking about care or saying, "Have you done so-and-so and have you fed so-and-so?" All of these things add to the sense of the focus being on the task. So part of our training in Butterfly is to reduce the focus on the task and to very much try and encourage people to behave as they would in their own home. How would it feel? So we need to see people sitting down more, staff teams slowing the pace, creating a relaxed feel, being with people and spending time sitting, chatting, sharing conversations, sharing themselves. And the key to this is reducing the them and us features. That staff somehow have to reduce the power that inevitably you have when you're in a position of responsibility, and to try and get rid of that sense that somehow we are different. So I often say when you go into a Butterfly home, it's not always apparent who are staff and who are residents and who are relatives, because the point is that we're creating a sense of people sharing the day together. Some of our critics say, well, it's important to know who the nurse is or who the carers are. But what we find is instinctively people living with dementia and their relatives come to know who they can reach out to for help. But the point is you've created a culture where everybody is there to support each other. And that we don't have divisions between all the various roles, the housekeeper, the chef, the administrator, the personal support workers, the nurses. Their principal focus is on the relationships between them, between each other and between the people that they're supporting. That this separation between residents and staff is not a helpful thing to create a sense of family. And you can see here one of our lovely nurses in a butterfly home in Kitchener, Natalia, demonstrating that nurses don't have to look like nurses. And the use of colour and personal items to create wonderful butterfly moments. In order to be a butterfly, we say it's really important to use your personal belongings, your possessions, your clothes, your identity to sort of really make connections with people. And this has never been more important than when we're wearing masks. More recently, we've lost the use of our faces. So we need to use our clothes, our shoes, our hats to connect with people more and more, because obviously the loss of a large part of our face using masks has been a huge shift of difficulty for many people during this very, very traumatic time. Another aspect that has been challenged during the pandemic is team members sharing the same food and sharing the meal. And I think everyone would say that when we're in a home together, we eat together, we eat the same food and we sit at the same table, and mealtime is a huge part of the social experience of the day. And you can see in this photograph before the pandemic, sharing something on a phone, perhaps a photograph or something of interest to the woman at the table. And sharing food is obviously something that hasn't been allowed during the pandemic because of not being able to take masks off. And we've really noticed some people living with dementia becoming quite worried or upset about this, you know, as they're eating, what they want to automatically, obviously, have the person sitting beside them have some of the food that they want to share. I had a story from a colleague in Ontario saying that there was a woman who was of Italian heritage who was a grandmother. She wanted the worker beside her to have some of the food that she was eating. It's a very core part of our identity sometimes to give and share with others. So I very much look forward to the time, hopefully when we're through this dreadful pandemic, to see this family dining experience restored, as it's such a core part of our philosophy. And again, this real focus for us in terms of relationships, that we want a confident and compassionate approach to affectionate touch being not only permitted, but actually actively encouraged. And there has been a trend in some training in the past to say that we can't be too physically close, that we have to maintain our boundaries. Certainly in old-fashioned nurse and medical training, this was a focus. But our argument would be that for many people living with dementia, this kind of close contact, this affection, this sense that you get of really truly being loved and cared for by hugs, holding hands, and all the things that many of us enjoy in our own lives, needs to be a core part of any kind of great emotion-based care. And I think this photograph really says that all. You can see in this image this incredible sense of connection and closeness between, this is a recreation worker and a woman living with dementia, that she's obviously feeling a bit sad, and they're sitting together on a couch or a sofa, holding tight to each other. And we always say that in the butterfly home, we promote the use of sofas or couches because they encourage people to be close. So more sofas or couches and less individual chairs with wings where people are separated from each other. In this image, I wanted to show that the care throughout the day needs to be shaped by people's life stories and personal interests. And we saw that in the stories of Georgie and Raj in particular, that people continuing to do the things that make sense to them, and why the use of dolls particularly allows people to still maintain that nurturing, loving connection with their babies. Again, years ago, these were very frowned upon because they were seen as childish. But we know now in dementia care that many people who have that desire to feel connected as parents, both mothers or fathers, a doll can provide this real sense of secure attachment and love. And the man in the middle here, who obviously was of a farmer's background, I think, having contact with horses and animals, very key to his well-being. And the woman on the left keeping busy helping the laundry worker with putting some of the clothes away. But the message behind these slides is that activity should be integrated throughout the whole day, not just the domain of the recreational program facilitators, but that every part of the day has potential to involve and help people to feel a sense of purpose and occupation and well-being. And the environment reflects this as well. Some nice pictures here of a home where there were a lot of people who used to enjoy fishing. So there's been some effort to make a sort of lovely 3D kind of mural of fishing to prompt conversation and reminiscing about fishing, and a picnic hamper in the middle there, and some cooking utensils on the wall here. So quite a strong focus in creating butterfly environments is to create invitations that prompt people to talk and share together, and that there's lots of things to engage, catch the eye and engage interest, and encourage people to chat and touch and explore the environment. Perhaps more than anything, the focus is on managing risk in a positive way. So I encourage you to look at this picture and think, do you first think, oh my goodness, that man is very close to the edge of the water? Are his brakes on? Is he safe? Or is your first thought to think, wow, isn't that wonderful that a man living in a care home can still enjoy being in the great expanse of this lovely, lovely water in Alberta fishing, that he's still supported to continue to do the thing he loves, and that risk has been looked at, but actually at the end of the day, well-being has been the central focus, and that we need to start in risk assessments with looking at the benefits of people doing things rather than immediately looking to stop things because we're concerned about someone's physical safety. The key here is people's emotional well-being being at the heart of all our decision making. So I'm going to return now to the picture of my mum and Bill. And again, I find it hard to see this picture. Mum, I'm sorry, I'm sure you do too if you're listening to this presentation. And at the time I wrote a poem, and I think it speaks to what we need to achieve in terms of the changes of creating more emotion-based care. The picture paints 365 days of longing. Mum says, if only, as she reaches for her beloved. He says, do we have an axe to break the glass? I say, good question. And the reason the axe is symbolic for me is that I do think the glass represents many of the barriers that we're facing at this time in terms of the restrictions, the fears, the highly regulated environment that we're all working in, that sometimes prevents the very innovation that we're looking for. We need to work with the regulators to understand that in order to create this emotion-based care that we all want, we need to be more proactive, more positive. We need to work in a more supportive and collaborative way. And my sense sometimes with the regulators is that many of the care homes I'm working with in Ontario, and I am working at a distance to be fair, feel constantly a sense of being under scrutiny in a way that feels hard for them to take some of the risks that I've talked about, because there is this fear always of scrutiny and punishment. And this punitive culture doesn't encourage innovation. We need to really get to grips with this together, to work with the regulators, work with the ministry, to make these things happen. And this requires a very, very collaborative and supportive approach. And what we need, I suppose, from all of us is these two great things, belief and passion. We can't do it alone. We need relatives, we need nurses, we need personal support workers, we need politicians, we need the whole groundswell of public opinion to get behind believing there is a better way for long-term care. I've seen it, I know it, I've seen that it's possible. I want us to share these possibilities, to not put up with the beige walls, clinical task-based care, to really advocate that things can be better. We have to share this passion, we have to spread the word. It's very, very important at this time as we emerge out of the pandemic to have hope for the future, to not live in the context of fear, but to emerge in shared belief and passion for a better future. So I'm going to share finally a poem, and I hope that this will help us get a sense of the possibilities. So what is a butterfly home? A home with a heart, not a place of work. It feels like family, but not the fake Christmas card, TV ad, Facebook kind. A family which looks out for everyone and doesn't avoid those who are angry or lost. A space full of light and bright colours which awaken my spirit. A home with a sofa where we can sit close together. Somewhere I feel safe inside, even when I'm not sure who or where I am. A place full of laughter, but where it's okay to cry. And there's always a hug or a hand when I need it. A house without locks, where I'm free to walk and explore. Somewhere I can be busy or quiet and still feel needed and noticed. Where I can have breakfast late in my pajamas or wake in the night and find a friend who will chat and share a snack. Or when I want my mum, someone can be who I need them to be. And where moment by moment, you accept me for me. And I'm going to stop there on time, I hope, for inviting some questions. I can see some comments in the chat box. Thank you so much for listening.
So thank you, Sally. It's been really exciting to listen to you and to hear you speak about things that our listeners are saying, why can't we do some of these things in just the environment that we have right now? And will this change the culture? And would some of these changes be simple and easy and cost effective? So I'm listening to the chat box and I'm reading some of these things. But you have mentioned that it's the culture. It's the culture of care. And you've said the barriers, one of the biggest barriers are the regulators and what's going on and how we need to work with them. And so how do we start that process? I mean, I don't think there's anyone here who's not thinking this would be great to do. How do we do this?
I mean, I think there are opportunities with the Long-Term Care Act coming out, but what I'm hearing from my colleagues in Canada is that there's lots of certainly a desire to move in this direction, but then at the same time, lots of constraints that make it very difficult to make it happen. So I'd love us to get advocates like ourselves in a room with the key influencers to talk about how we can work more positively together. It does feel that there's a bit of a brick wall. That, you know, the act that I talked about, that Bill, my stepdad, talked about, feels quite symbolic. It feels quite impenetrable, and yet we know that we have the stories to share that Moira Welsh and others have talked about in terms of the implementation of the model in Ontario, and that there are many projects working with Meaningful Care Matters now to put this into practice. So the stories and the evidence is there. We do need to get better at gathering the evidence, and we are starting to do that more to show people that it does take work, it does take commitment, it takes inspired leadership. And that's a big piece of the culture change for us, is to develop leaders who get this, who have it in their core, who have it in their heart to make these changes. But it's not impossible. We know we can do it. And so I suppose I'm encouraging all the relatives who are listening here to talk to the homes that you're in contact with, to get them, as we heard from Claude at the beginning, to talk to the politicians about this being higher up the political agenda, and particularly for us to have some more conversations with those higher up in the ministry. I mean, I really hope that the ministry might be able to see this presentation and for us to have conversations, because there are good people there, we know that, but we just need to have more training for the new inspectors, because there are many more inspectors being brought on board, so that they are starting to work in this way to support homes and to talk together, rather than work in this rather, as I say, this is more critical way, which is not very helpful, particularly in the context of the very exhausted and demoralized teams who've been through this pandemic. Never has it been more important to look after the staff and not punish them, because if this model works well, it means the staff are faring better too. And I think that's a conversation to have with unions too, because unions obviously need to be on board with this and to understand that this is good for staff teams as well. And we certainly have evidence on that too.
It's interesting in your presentation, obviously Kit was the basis for the butterfly model, and he was such a guru and so important to us in the 1990s. And I think, you know, when we look at the emotion-based models of care, and you put love at the center, which it is, in our present system, we just don't go up and hug our residents very carefully. Some do, some staff do, let me say they do, they're kind, compassionate, and will do that, but it's not a norm. And it's not a norm to spend time sitting and talking and chatting. The norm is to do the tasks and to get the tasks done. And we don't have enough staff to get the task done. So the issue becomes staffing. And so the question has come up, does a butterfly model or any emotion-based model of care require more staff? And what would be the upfront cost to get something like this started?
I mean, the issue of staffing and time obviously comes up an awful lot. I mean, we would argue that actually sometimes it's not necessarily the quantity of staff, it's the way that staff shift their thinking, so that even when they're doing the task, they involve people in the task, or that they create moments, they think of things to put on tables that offer opportunities for people to engage. So it's not always about the staffing as such, it's the way that the staff spend their day and the way that they interact. And so that takes some investment in training to get staff thinking about that. So that's a potential cost. But once staff actually have that training, what we find is it's for many care teams, they go, well, we knew that was right, actually. It doesn't take a lot to convert staff, if you like, because most of the really good workers understand that this is the way that they should, you know, they should be, you know, that this is at the core of being affectionate with people when they need it. I'm not suggesting you go and hug everyone randomly. Obviously, I noticed in the chat box there was a bit of conversation around that. But if someone approaches you and needs touch and connection, that it's really important to respond in the way that that person needs in that moment.
Right. It's a culture of care. Sorry.
It is a culture shift. I mean, clearly, staffing levels do need to be looked at, and there has been some more funding on the basis of the recent changes coming out of the pandemic that has increased some staffing in some of our homes, which is certainly obviously a help. I'm not saying that it wouldn't be good to have a better staff to resident ratio, but some of the changes can be done. You know, I've visited homes which have got quite poor staffing ratios, but because of the way the staff are and the shared approach with the housekeepers and the kitchen staff, and that it isn't just the care workers' role to connect with people, it can be done.
You mentioned in your presentation, sorry, Sally, you mentioned in your presentation many times about your dementia residents, your dementia people that live in the homes. Does this model work for people with non-dementia? Because, you know, there's 20–30% of people without dementia living in long-term care homes in our countries, generally speaking. So would it work for them too?
Yes, we have an adapted model, which Meaningful Care Matters is now rolling out, called the Dragonfly Model. We've gone with the insect metaphor, but for which is many of the same principles, but adapted for those who don't have a dementia. And at the core of that, again, is that sense of creating a sense of family home. And so, yes, I think this approach has much relevance for people, everybody, if you like, and for people with learning disabilities as well. So although the focus of the butterfly approach has been on people living with dementia, I think there's much that could be transferred to many of the homes we are working in now do have adults living there without a dementia. Some of the colour focus that you saw in some of those pictures might be slightly more, what's the word, less vibrant, if you like, in some of the homes for people without dementia, because we do see it through the lens of people who need those enhanced colours. I mean, I can imagine my mum, who doesn't have a dementia, having a fit if she ended up in a home with all those bright colours. So, you know, there are issues sometimes about thinking about how we adapt some of the environmental issues for those who don't have a dementia.
So would you put people, different cultures together then? Like we heard one presentation through our webinars where they've actually made a separate area for certain cultures. So a focus for them. And so what would you do in this instance where it's a multicultural kind of area and you're trying to implement the butterfly model?
Yes, I mean, I think some homes have got houses for people of Chinese heritage, for example, Portuguese, other. I mean, I suppose the key there is about whether your language and identity is very linked to that cultural heritage. Some people might prefer to be in a more mixed environment, so it's got to be very individually assessed. You know, you wouldn't necessarily want to be put in a house with people of the same background necessarily, but I think the great advantage of, obviously, particularly in the Chinese household, for example, is the food and making sure that, you know, that the diet and the language and everything feels familiar, because that's what most of us need to feel at home, is to be around people who help us feel at home. The thing that is sad for me, and certainly I saw that in my recent visit to Ontario, was I met a woman who was Italian, and I speak quite good Italian, and I spoke to her in Italian and her face came to light and she started to talk in a very animated way, and the care worker who I was with said that she hadn't lit up in that way for months. And I thought, this is an Italian woman who hasn't had anyone speaking Italian to her for months. But that really worries me, if someone is so deprived of their first language and they've lost their ability to use English because of their cognitive impairment. How awful that must be.
Do you think that people are living longer in emotion-based models of care such as butterfly because they're happier? Do you think that's a good thing to say?
I don't have the statistics on that, but certainly I see that people, yes, are living better and therefore eating better. Certainly we're starting to show in our statistics, because food becomes more of a social event, and so people definitely are doing well because they thrive when there's still a life to be enjoyed living in homes.
Right.
I noticed some people in the chats there saying, you know, this is easy, we can do it, and it doesn't necessarily need a major transformation. I think it just needs the belief, it needs a staff team who understands it. What else are we seeing in the chat box there, Marge? There's lots of people saying.
They're all talking about the way that this can be implemented. And I guess the issue is, let's take you're talking about the butterfly model. Are there upfront costs to starting a butterfly model in a home here?
Yeah, I mean, the Meaningful Care Matters, obviously we talk to individual homes about what works for them. There's no one size fits all. So we haven't got a sort of actual budget on it, so to speak, because obviously it depends on the needs of the home. I mean, we start usually with a day's observation in the home. And by the observation, I don't mean that we're checking paperwork and doing any of the things that the regulators do. We literally just sit in the living areas for 5.5 hours and really observe the lived experience of the day for people there. And as a result of that observational audit, we then do a series of recommendations for what might be able to transform that particular home. And depending on budgets, etc., we obviously have to adapt. I mean, in some homes now we are doing smaller pieces of work because that's what's financially viable. But the observational piece is really important for us, and teaching the staff how to do observations so that they themselves can, if you sit outside of, and anyone listening here who works in a home, I really recommend it, just spending 2 hours outside of providing the care and watching the day unfold can give you incredible insights on what is going well and what isn't going well. And that's something all of you could do for free if you like. I mean, apart from the time you spend in the 2 hours doing it, which obviously is a commitment, that is one of the key elements of our culture change process, is to encourage people to observe the lived experience and face the reality of what's happening in homes. And it can be very emotional. I mean, in a home I did this in recently in Ontario, a housekeeper came after doing the observation in floods of tears, and she was a lovely housekeeper, and she said, I feel so guilty that I've been doing my housework, I've been focusing on the jobs of cleaning, and I don't feel I've spent enough time talking to people and stopping to chat to people. And she was so upset by it. But what that enabled was the rest of the group to understand that they also need to just think about the way in which they did their jobs. You know, this lovely insight from this housekeeper. She says, from now on, when I'm doing the cleaning, I know it's okay to stop and have a chat or go into someone's room and sit on their bed for a few minutes. And
do you use volunteers in your homes?
Yes, absolutely. Volunteers can be wonderful, particularly for the conversational piece and finding connections with life story. So there's a nice example in the region of Peel of a man who used to be a police officer having visitors who used to work in the police themselves. So obviously he enjoys the conversations with people who have a knowledge of his particular job. So I think we can be creative about recruiting volunteers who have interests or perhaps languages, in the case of the Italian woman I mentioned. It's been difficult in the pandemic because obviously all those external inputs have been much less, but let's hope they will start again. And the same with churches and, you know, fulfilling people's spiritual needs, bringing in more input from faith communities to support people with faith.
Right, we're running down to the bewitching hour, and I just see a note from Mary Connell saying hello to Sally. So I'm passing that on. And so how do we contact you if we're interested, if we are working in a home or thinking that way? Do we contact Meaningful Care Matters to start the ball rolling? How does it work?
Yes, please. admin@meaningfulcarematters.com. I can put that on the screen if that's helpful. Let me just put that picture up if I can get it. Can people see that?
Yeah.
Please do get in contact with us. We'd love to hear from you. But just to emphasize, as some of your people in the chat box said, there are still lots of things you can do to make a difference. It's not just about working with Meaningful Care Matters. It's something all of us needs to be part of. But please do get in contact if you're interested in finding out about our, you know, the range of support options that we can offer.
So thank you, Sally. And I'm going to turn it over to Kathleen Edwards, who's the Education Manager for Family Councils of Ontario.
Hi, everyone. Thank you so much, Sally and Marg and Claude, for coming to Family Council Ontario with such a wonderful webinar. Such, you know, a nice follow-up to our January webinar where Mary Connolly spoke about the butterfly model and kind of the ideas behind it. But then Sally kind of brought some really good examples of how it's been implemented within homes and some ideas about how you might start the conversation. One thing I am going to say is that Family Councils Ontario does have a book club where we're reading Happily Ever Older by Moira Welsh. And our first chapter did talk about the Peel homes and the butterfly effect. And so we are going to be going through a process of exploring different approaches to care within, you know, around the world. If you're interested in joining the book club, there are still spaces available, and how you can sign up for that is you would go to the Family Council Ontario website and just register for the book club. We'd be happy to have you join us. You don't have to read the book in advance to join. You can just come and participate in the conversation. But once again, thank you so much on behalf of Family Councils Ontario for coming and spending the hour with us. It has been a wonderful, insightful session. I think something that's motivated quite a few individuals, given us a lot of food for thought to take away. And thank you so much to Sally and Marg and Claude.
If there are any questions that I need to pick up, do save the questions and I'll endeavour to answer some of them individually.
Okay, perfect. We'll do that. And they're saying standing ovation.
Thank you, everyone. Really lovely to see you all.
you.